This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Laura Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host Renee Williams. And today in studio we have Gabby Wolf. And Gabby is a master's student in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. And today we're going to be talking with her about her graduate work on otters. So it's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Thank you.
You received a double degree from Texas A&M University in Wildlife and Fisheries Science, and then also in Ecological Restoration. And now you're here at the University of Kentucky doing a Master's of Science in Forest and Natural Resource Sciences. And I hear you're going to be finishing up in August, so that's great that you're almost done.
I'm so excited.
That's exciting. Now, before we get started talking about your work with otters, tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in kind of the wildlife side of things.
Okay, so I actually started off my undergrad career doing engineering. I wanted to be an environmental engineer, and then I realized that I did not like programming and MATLAB, and it was just really hard, and I hated school, and I had never hated school in my entire life. And so I transferred over to chemistry because I still wanted to do something environmental, and I had liked chemistry during high school, and then I realized I did not like doing labs. And one day, talking to one of my advisors, they told me that we had a wildlife program at Texas A&M, and I had no clue. And that same weekend, I just switched my major and didn't regret it at all.
And so what brought you to UK?
I was actually visiting my dad. He recently retired and moved to Cincinnati, and I was visiting him, and the only way to get a university excused absence was to come and look at grad schools while I was over here. So I did a quick Google search, looked at UK, and came down and thought Kentucky was really pretty, and I had a really good conversation with one of my advisors and applied, and here I am.
Great.
So what first got you interested in the wildlife aspect of it?
You know, I watched a lot of TV when I was little. I didn't have a lot of experiences to go outdoors. My mom was a single mom, so she worked a lot and didn't really have enough time to take us to the parks or anything because she was also going to school at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so I watched a lot of Animal Planet, Steve Irwin, and I just really, really liked it. And I guess I kind of never grew out of that wildlife phase that I had when I was like 6 years old.
Oh, that's good. So tell us a little bit about your research that you've been working on.
Yeah, so I'm currently studying river otter diet in New Mexico. It's part of a larger study where they're trying to figure out a lot of population dynamics. So I guess backstory to it is historically in North America, river otters were over-trapped, over-hunted because they have a really nice pelt. So in, I guess, the 1800s, late 1700s, 1800s, people wanted fur coats, wanted fur, and river otters have really nice fur. So they were over-hunted, or over-trapped actually. And by 1953 in New Mexico, the last river otter was caught actually in a beaver trap. And so for almost 60 years, there weren't any otters in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. And that kind of threw off the dynamics of river systems because they are an apex predator for larger rivers. So they kind of regulate prey fish and they just eat everything. So any prey items are managed in a way by river otters. So that kind of threw off the dynamics. And so in the early 2000s, there was a huge movement by local organizations and people, citizens of New Mexico, who wanted to restore rivers to their natural systems. So they brought in 33 river otters between 2010 and 2012. They brought them in from Washington and reintroduced them, and there were kind of no further studies in New Mexico until now. So now we want to know what's going on, how many river otters there are, how far they've moved, and what they're eating. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I come in, and I actually look at their scat. So I look at their poop to see what hard remains there are. So bones, scales, what types of insects, that kind of thing, to kind of get a bigger picture of what impact they're having in the system.
So how many otters have you found? What's the population?
So
Or
we
can you
don't have
tell?
the population
Okay.
data yet. John Cox is
Okay.
the one doing the data stuff, so he'll hopefully soon we'll have that information.
Okay. And have you learned anything about their range or based on what they're eating?
Not necessarily their range. We do have reports that they're all the way. So the original release site was in northern New Mexico in Taos County, which is, I think, about 2 hours south of the Colorado border. And they've already gone down to north of Albuquerque. So that's maybe 300 miles in dispersal overall.
So they can really travel.
Yeah. So they're moving down and they're reproducing. We just don't know how far exactly or how fast they are reproducing.
Okay. So how did you get your data? How are you getting your information?
Yeah. So for part of the year, I had some technicians out in New Mexico who would go and they would scout the sites over summer. So in late June, I went out with one of my undergraduate student workers and we collected the scat. And we have it stored here. We had it stored here in the freezer. And then so the basic process was we had it frozen, we defrosted it, we rinsed it, and used a small hand sieve and basically removed the fecal matter. And then once it was dry, we would go in and separate scales or bones, and using a key that I made before, I would identify them to family. So based on characteristics of scales, I would determine whether it was a trout or a sucker, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
That's really interesting. As far as your research goes, how long have you been doing this otter research in New Mexico?
I've been at the University of Kentucky since 2017, and field collection started February of 2018. So we collected pretty much a whole year straight. So early February to mid-December of 2018.
Okay. Have you found anything unusual that you wouldn't imagine that you would find that they have eaten?
So we did find a lot of plastic, but we also found a lot of like lead sinkers, flies, I guess they're called.
Fishing equipment.
Yeah. So we found a lot of fishing equipment hooks that just survive the digestive tract, and sometimes we look at this and we're like, how are you alive? So occasionally we'll find a scat with a bunch of feathers and we're like, oh, this one got a bird. But mostly it's just fish and crayfish that we're finding.
And is that their general diet then?
Yeah, so
Just fish.
I think in pretty much all of their locations, wherever they're found, the primary prey items are fish and crayfish, and occasionally, depending on what's available, there'll be other things like reptiles or amphibians. It all kind of just depends on what's around, because otters, they're considered opportunistic carnivores, so whatever they can catch and eat is what they're going to be eating.
Okay.
So do they stay in the water most of the time, or are they land dwellers as well?
Yes, so unlike sea otters, I like to do the comparison between sea otters and river otters. Sea otters live mostly in the water. They'll eat on the water. They'll raise their young in the water, so they rarely ever go onto land. Whereas river otters, there's almost an even split. So they will hunt in the water, but when they hunt, they'll bring their prey on land, and then they'll eat on land, and they'll defecate on land and give birth on land. So I don't really know what time amount they spend in water, but they do use land pretty often.
Okay.
And occasionally they'll like cross streets, and you'll see random videos of river otters in the road. And they do get hit by cars pretty often.
Oh, goodness.
So they do use land more than we would think.
How big do they get?
I would say a male is about nose to tip of the tail, maybe. A large male would be about 5 feet long.
That's larger than I thought.
Yeah.
So their tails are pretty much most of their length.
Oh, okay.
And then females are obviously smaller. And then it depends on conditions. If there's a lot of food to eat, they'll probably be bigger. And if it's food scarce, they'll be smaller, on the smaller end.
Do you call it, when they have their babies, is it a litter or what?
I've heard different things about river otters. So I think the most common term is a litter.
Pups or whatever you want to call them.
They're sometimes called cubs. They're sometimes called pups.
Uh-huh.
I guess it depends on who's calling them what.
Right.
I think 2 to 3 is the most
average.
common. And once again, it depends on food. So there's a lot of food, they'll probably have more pups, and then if there's less food, they'll have less.
How often would they have these pups?
So there's some research suggests that they can start having, so females can reproduce at their first year, so at year 1, but they don't typically reproduce until their second year. And then I believe it takes about a year and a half for the pups to wean. But there's different opinions on it depending on where you are.
And how long do they normally live?
You know what? I don't know for sure, but I want to say about 12 years, 13 years. And I don't know if that's the age for in captivity, but they can live a pretty long time.
Right.
And what do they consider home? Is it
What do you-
on the land, or do they build a nest? What do they do?
So they have,
since they do both water and land.
they basically, they'll have what I guess you can consider territories. I don't know if they're defended or not. They'll have several locations, so they'll swim like certain stretches of the river, and they'll visit the same sites over again. I just don't know if there's a pattern to these visits. And hopefully Dr. Cox's research will be able to tell us who's visiting where and how often
So they have
they're
summer
visiting.
homes and vacation homes.
So when we were out there, the river was low, so there was a drought and the water levels were low, and we noticed that they weren't visiting certain sites anymore. And that's probably because certain fish couldn't swim there anymore, so they just scooted over and they moved on to deeper water.
Okay. So these are rivers, so they're just in rivers at this point for the river otters.
Yeah, so river otters, they can occur on the coast as well, but we just have a lot less states that are on the coast.
Right.
But they're mostly in freshwater rivers or freshwater.
Okay, so you're here in Kentucky,
Yes.
but you're doing your research in New Mexico. Explain that.
I guess I was just in the right place at the right time. So one of Dr. Cox's previous students, he worked for a while with New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, and they started the River Otter Project, and they kind of he contacted Dr. Cox, and they worked something out together, and here I am.
Yeah.
So who's on your master's committee?
So my main advisors are Dr. John Cox and Matt Springer, and Dr. Michael Lackey is my third committee member.
Okay. No, that's a great committee. That sounds like good.
So now, is a lot of the similarities the same, that you could bring the information back from New Mexico and utilize it in Kentucky? Is that how it would work as well?
I think the general data is yes. Their overall ecology is pretty much the same regardless of where they are. They are usually the apex predator in the water, definitely not on land. Or an otter on land is not well protected, but in the water they swim really well. They can smell really well in the water. And the only situation that they wouldn't be the top predator would be in coastal systems where there's like orca or alligators or something else that's bigger in the water that can eat them. But for the most part, they're the apex predator. So they eat, and like I said before, they eat whatever they can catch. And usually that's fish of the same size, so about 10 to 30 centimeters, slower moving fish, and then they'll eat crayfish. And, well, fish and crayfish are available throughout pretty much everywhere. The types of fish they eat are similar. They might not be the same species, but the types of fish they're eating are similar across the board. And they have that same regulatory, power over preys and prey dynamics.
You're doing research on otters, so obviously you care about them. So why should our listeners care about otters and your research?
Personally, I think they're just really cute and they're fun
They
to
are
see.
really cute. You see those pictures where they're swimming on their backs, and it's really cute.
They're super cute, but there's management implications. So in a lot of areas, crayfish aren't native, so they do eat a lot of crayfish, so they can help regulate invasive species. Some research suggests that they'll weed out fish that people don't want to catch, so the non-trophy fish type. They'll eat those, opening more room up for trophy fish, so a lot of trout can do better, and so as well as bass can do better, it's suggested. And then in a lot of areas, people trap them, so there's an economic advantage to having otters where people can go out, trap otters, participate in that, and then contribute financially to conservation as well as sustain themselves on river otters.
Do people still trap them for their fur? I know you had mentioned that earlier.
Yes, they still trap them, but I don't think there's a lot of regulations to how you can trap their seasons. And certain states, even though they do have river otters, they do not allow trapping on river otters. New Mexico is one of them because they have such a small population. So there's a lot of regulations to go. I think Kentucky does trap and they have a trapping season, but I'm not a trapper, so I wouldn't know exactly where or when you can do that.
I'm assuming there's several river otters in Kentucky as well.
Yes, Kentucky does have river otters. I think they started a reintroduction or recovery of river otters in the mid to late 1980s, and they've done pretty well in, I want to say, eastern Kentucky. They're doing pretty well. And then there's otters in Lexington. They tend to avoid human areas, so if a lot of people are going there, they probably won't. But then this weird fear of people is overcome when there's a lot of food.
Oh, okay.
So if there's a lot of fish in the area, they'll probably say, okay, I'm okay with people because there's fish.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. So I know, as a graduate student, you mentioned you had an undergraduate helping you collect data, and a lot of what you're doing requires a lot of work and a lot of help. Can you tell us about some of the people that you've had working with you?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to receive a grant from the Student Sustainability Council, and I was able to hire 8 student workers over a year to help me process samples. But one particular student, Keely Cohen, she was able to go out with me to New Mexico and help me in the field. And when we came back to the lab, we noticed we were finding a lot of little plastic pieces. And so we thought that was interesting. So we developed an undergraduate project for her. And she recently presented a poster at the Kentucky chapter of the Wildlife Society annual meeting and presented her research and was awarded Best Student Poster.
Oh, wow.
So I'm actually really proud of her, and I'm really excited about the microbead project. It's the first time microbeads have been reported in the region, so that's really interesting. And we're just having a good time trying to get her published.
Okay. And so for those that may not know what the microbeads are, what is it? Can you explain a little bit more about it?
Of course. So microbeads are a type of microplastic, and microplastic has varying definitions, but it's very 0.5 millimeter in length would be considered a microplastic.
Okay.
And then a microbead would be smaller
Okay.
or it would be a bead shape that fits that description. I think that's the size. It might be wrong.
Okay. It's okay.
But it's basically a very, very small piece of plastic that's not visible, or that's almost not visible to the naked eye. I was able to see some, but my older advisors were not able to see them. So I guess it depends on your vision.
And where does this come from? Is it plastics in our environment?
Yeah, so the plastics are in the environment. We're not necessarily sure where they're coming from in this
pop
location.
bottles, or where is it coming from?
Before 2015, a lot of beauty products had plastic beads in them. We think that when people used to wash their faces or use those shampoos or facial cleansers, they would go down into the water and they weren't removed during whatever water treatment happened. And then a lot of times it could be general plastic that we're using that gets into the systems, but a lot of abrasives, so commercial abrasives, are also made out of plastic and they get washed down into the water system. So there's various sources of these plastics and we don't necessarily know where they're coming from in this area.
That's interesting that you've been able to expand your research and, have another undergraduate student help. I know also you've worked with some high school students here in Lexington. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So we had a total of 4 students from the STEAM Academy in Lexington. Basically are required to have an internship each semester they're enrolled. And so for this semester and last semester, we had some students and they came in and they were basically another student worker. And they came in and sorted scat, rinsed scat, and moved the process along and did a lot of really valuable work.
Explain to our listeners that may not be familiar with it, the STEAM Academy, what it stands for.
STEAM stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math, I believe.
think so.
And so they're enrolled in a special program that focuses in these fields, and they look for internships pretty much from their sophomore year on. They're doing an internship each semester, so I think that's super impressive.
Yeah, and that's a great opportunity.
Yeah.
That's good that you're able to mentor them and give them that research
Oh
opportunity.
yeah, definitely. It was a lot of fun.
That's good. So how many samples would they have to sort through, or what scale are we looking at for what you had to do?
We had 20 locations throughout the upper Rio Grande River, as well as the Rio Pueblo and the Red River in Taos County, New Mexico. And from these 20 sites, we collected, I want to say, about 860 scat.
Wow.
So there was a lot of poop.
Right. And how long would it take you to process one from the time you had to rinse it and separate it to identify it?
So I guess at first, when we first started sorting, it probably took an hour and a half to do the whole rinsing, sorting, identifying, maybe an hour and a half. But towards the very end of it, when everyone was used to their process in it, maybe half an hour.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's good.
And then, so of course we rinsed it. We had to wait for it to dry. So it took about 24 hours for it to dry. But the actual work that we put in, maybe 30 minutes towards the very end when we're actually good at what we're doing and there's not that learning curve.
Yeah, oh, that's good. And what are some of the challenges that you ran into collecting your data and being out in the field doing your work?
Yeah, of course. So I had never been to this part of New Mexico. I didn't know what I was expecting. And when I get there, it's high elevation, desert, and I had no idea where I was going. So the first 2-3 days, we basically drove around and found our starting points. And what we realized when we started was that most of our sites weren't trails. They were kind of they weren't marked trails. It was kind of just an opening where a lot of people had been going down, and BLM was okay with that. So we would drive up basically to the edge of a cliff and have to find our way down.
Oh, no.
No. And a lot of the times it was pretty scary because we would drive up, there was a cliff, and I would say maybe 1,000 feet below, maybe a little bit more. It felt like a lot more was our river, so we would have to climb down, and I mean some of our sites were trails, but we would have to climb down and then walk alongside the river to find our poop, and sometimes we couldn't find it, and so that was one of our main issues, was actually getting to our sites. And then at some point our vehicle started having issues, so we would time in particular we were driving, and then all of a sudden the vehicle was decelerating. We were going uphill and we're like, we don't know what's happening. The vehicle actually shifted into neutral. And we're like, okay, this is scary. And another time we were parked on a hill at the very end of the day, and we came back and we're tired and we're ready to go, and it's been a long day, and the car wouldn't start. And we were basically just stuck in the middle of nowhere because it wasn't a known site. It was very backwoods, and we decided that we were going to shake the vehicle. And shaking the vehicle worked. And it was just one of those things that we were tired enough to think that the simple solution will work, and it did. And we got out of there and we had a snow cone on the way home. And what other challenges?
Heard something about fire ants.
Fire ants, yes. So my intern Keely had never had an experience with fire ants. Being from Texas, I know about fire ants and where to avoid them and not let them touch me. But she didn't. So we were looking for samples at the very end of the day, and I mentioned to her, I'm like, hey, be careful, there's ants here. And she was like, okay, cool, I won't step on them. But she didn't realize that they had already gotten on her, and they went up her pants. So she was like, oh, I don't know what's hurting. And I'm like, you have ants on you. And she basically had to get undressed by the side of the river in plain sight of maybe 20 people to get the pants off, and she was screaming and pretty terrible.
Yeah.
She learned a lesson about fire ants, and I don't think she's ever gonna forget
That
Yeah.
lesson. Yeah. So when you were talking about the rivers were on, down, were you like scaling these trails enough that you could get to these rivers?
So some locations there were some trails that like you can tell it was a trail, but you couldn't. It was probably a very rarely used trail.
Right.
But there were other places that we weren't necessarily scaling, but we were definitely jumping from a rock to another rock or sliding.
So I was wondering, like, do you have ropes to try to get
no,
down?
so
these?
we weren't that sophisticated.
Okay.
But some locations we felt like we should have had ropes. In fact, there was one site that previous to getting there, some hikers had actually fallen, or a hiker had fallen off the cliff, and BLM closed that trail, and so we just didn't go to that site anymore because we didn't want to risk falling, because me personally, I fall on flat ground, so I didn't want to fall off and not get my degree.
Yeah, I don't blame you. You kind of explained a little bit, but if you would have to explain, what's a week in the life of a grad student?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variability to being a grad student. Sometimes depends on when you have a field season. So if you're in your field season, you usually wake up really, really early, maybe 4 in the morning. You're driving by like 5. You work really, really hard, depending on the weather. Sometimes it's super hot. Sometimes it's nice weather. Most of the time, the weather doesn't cooperate. And then you just work your butt off, collect your poop, and then come back and try to relax and repeat it for a couple of days. Other times, me personally, I'd come to the office, answer emails, talk to the undergrads, try to figure out what's going on, if there's any problems in the lab. And then, of course, classes. So a lot of grad students have classes during the field season, so communicating with professors is definitely really high on the list, so they know when you're actually doing work. So a lot of professors are really understanding of when you have field work, and they will accommodate you for exams or project deadlines, and I've really appreciated that.
One thing I just realized we haven't talked about, though, is are there any unique characteristics that otters have compared to other animals?
Otters, they're a semi-aquatic predator, so they swim really, really well in the water. They have a really unique coloration where they're lighter on the bottom and darker on the top, so prey don't really see them as they swim above them, so they can sneak up. They have very good olfactory senses, so they can smell really well, which just aids them in hunting. But also, because of their olfactory senses, they can communicate via smells. So so
Okay, explain that one.
So, otters, when they poop, so they're very social animals. So they're usually in a group. When people see an otter, it's usually multiple otters that are there. And what they do is, on land, they have what are called latrine sites, and basically this is where they poop, and all of them poop at the same site. So whenever we go, it's never just like one scat or 2 scats, it's a bunch of scat. They can smell each other on these sites, and they also there's different kinds of poops, I guess, different kinds of
So you can tell what poop belongs to what otter?
No,
okay.
So they can tell what poop belongs to what otter.
But you can't.
But we can't.
Okay.
But there's also certain poops that have like a mucus. So they'll excrete more mucus for certain reasons. I'm not really sure why they excrete mucus, but it's definitely noticeable when a scat is just covered in it. And then other times it's not. It's thought that they communicate during a reproductive season. So during breeding seasons, females will signal to males that they're breeding, or when there's different otters from another pack or family group, they're called, or pack or family group, they will, I guess, defend their territories. I'm not necessarily sure if they get into otter fights, but they signal to other otters that this is where they are. And there have been different experiments where they'll remove all of the scat, and then they'll put scat from different otters that aren't in their pack, in their group, and then the otters will over defecate, and they just are like, this is mine. And they have their specific sites, latrine sites that they'll use.
Kind of like when you have a dog walking and they're trying to mark a different tree because some other dog has marked
Definitely.
it. Okay.
And in this case, it's poop and
right. That's interesting.
So what's next for you? What are you going to do after you graduate in August?
So I will be starting a PhD program at the University of Maine in Orono starting fall. So I'm really excited about that.
And do you know what you're going to be researching?
Yeah, I am going to be doing the human dimensions of wildlife conservation in relation to climate change.
Okay. No, it's great.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit?
The project hasn't really been developed yet. I'm part of a new cohort. They recently received a grant from the NSF, so it's a research trainee program. So they're having us kind of develop the program. So there's different aspects to it. But my side will definitely focus on how people are affected by wildlife and how climate change is going to impact all of that.
Okay. Well, you've given us a lot of information on otters. If you could give us a couple of takeaway items that our listeners could take home with them about this whole interview, what would that be?
There's still a lot of information to gain, and I think this research in particular is going to be very valuable for New Mexico, specifically because nothing else has been done. There hasn't been any other research in this region, so any bits of information is going to impact management decisions, fisheries decisions, specifically if they're going to be stocking more of certain species, so more trout species, or if they're just going to let the otters do what the otters are going to do and determine if they're going to release otters to any other regions of New Mexico.
That's good. Well, thank you so much. You present us with a lot of great information. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
All right, Matt, I think there's a good chance most people have heard that sound.
Yeah, so anytime anybody, downtown Lexington walks out, you got a tree in your front yard, you probably do hear that song, and that's a male robin. That's his song to attract a mate and defend his territory and all those things. So it's quite a common sound, especially April, May, and June.
When are they building nests?
Robins, American robins, are actually one of our first nesters for all of our migrants that come back. They'll start nesting. There's probably robins that have nests with eggs in them right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do those nests build out of?
They'll build their nests out of twigs and sticks, but the one thing that really helps point to it being a robin for us here around Lexington is they actually line the nest with mud. The female alone builds the nest, so she's the one that brings everything back and puts it all together, and that they have a mud cup nest is what we can commonly call that.
And so how many eggs do they lay?
Robins will lay anywhere between 3 to 5 eggs. Because they start so early, they can have up to 3 different nests a year that are successful. They have a really high survival rate of baby birds all the way through. So in terms of their population, they're actually probably our second most common bird in North America.
You see a lot of them.
There's a lot of them, and that's next to blackbirds, which you also see a lot of.
Right.
So they're doing quite well. They're not a species of concern for us. Their populations are probably increasing. They have 3 to 5 eggs. Those get predated on by things like snakes and squirrels and other birds and crows. But one of the really interesting things that robins do that a lot of other birds can't do is we have the cowbird is a nest parasitizer. It'll lay its egg in the nest itself and let the other parents take care of it. Robins can actually identify the eggs that aren't theirs and throw them out of the nest.
Really?
Which helps.
How is that?
Robins have a blue egg. It's it's one that a lot of people see falls out of nests. Right? So they may be able to tell the difference in size and color. Birds do actually pick up color on a different spectrum they can see in the UV spectrum, so they may be able to pick something up on that spectrum that tells them it's not theirs. And that actually saves them a lot of energy because those baby cowbirds are actually usually larger chicks, and they open their mouth wider, which is a signal to the parents to put the food here. So they usually get more food than the actual birds, other baby birds that are really the parents. So the ability to not have those in the nest is pretty big deal.
Yeah, that is a pretty big deal. Now, I've noticed robins will build nests pretty much anywhere.
They are not picky.
Right.
Anywhere they can fit it and
Fit a
it won't
ledge,
fall out, it will
right.
be there. Yeah, so on your houses, buildings, your small trees and bushes in the front yard, they will pretty much, if they can keep it there, it will be there. They're not picky at all.
So how long do baby birds stay in their nest?
The hatchlings will be pretty much able to fledge within a little over 2 to 3 weeks. And then 2 weeks after fledging, they are capable of actually flying over distances. So it's pretty quick. They grow up, and now mom and dad care for the fledglings. So a lot of times when people find birds outside of the nest on the ground, they think the bird fell out. Well, the bird probably actually jumped out. That's just how they are when they fledge, and they're the first couple of days they're not really that mobile. They have all their feathers, but they are only capable of really hopping around. And mom and dad will come find them and feed them wherever they are. But obviously at that point they're really vulnerable to anything like cats or maybe small dogs or raccoons or skunks will all potentially grab them and feed on them at that point.
You mentioned they migrate. Where do they migrate to?
So we're in a spot in the country in North America that has robins year round, but robins will come from make the journey from Canada down to the Central America annually, right, and come back up. And interestingly, here recently, a researcher at EKU found using band surveys over the last 20 or 30 years that robins are actually migrating less. They're going shorter distances in the winter. They don't have to go as far south to get the food they need. So that's something that came out of Kentucky that we'll bring up. They have a long natural history, never really been a species of concern, and actually traditionally before the Migratory Bird Act, we actually ate them.
Oh.
They were part of people's diets because they're so abundant.
They seem kind of small, but that's what I was
wondering.
wondering.
Very small, but it's all about numbers. Of them. Yes.
So speaking of eating, what do they eat?
So they eat a lot of invertebrates. Worms, obviously, is what people usually see them with. And the other big component is soft mast, so berries. Grape producers are not a big fan of robins.
Okay.
So if you'll also see them if you have blueberry bushes or mulberry bushes. They're big fans of those nice juicy berries.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for letting us know about robins.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us today, and we have a new show schedule for spring 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL 88.1 FM on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon. And if you miss the Monday shows, you can listen to our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM, and of course via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.